There is a certain silence that surrounds a man who lives alone. Not the awkward kind people fear, but a deeper, more revealing quiet one that listens back. In a world that constantly asks him who he is with, this man answers with who he is. He wakes up to rooms that hold only his breath, his thoughts, his unfinished dreams. No audience. No performance. Just presence. And that presence, though often misunderstood, is not empty. It is full of meaning waiting to be named. Solitude, when chosen consciously, stops being a verdict and becomes a declaration. A man who lives alone without a girlfriend is often assumed to be missing something, but what if he is holding something instead? Space. Space to hear his own thoughts without interruption, to sense his emotional weather without interpreting it through someone else's reactions, to move through his days guided by inner alignment rather than external expectation. This is not the solitude of exile, it is the solitude of authorship. He is not waiting on the sidelines of life, he is actively shaping the conditions under which his life unfolds. We confuse solitude with loneliness because we are taught that value is social proof. If no one chooses you, the story goes, then perhaps you are unchosen. But deliberate solitude rejects that narrative. It says, I am not absent from love, I am in rehearsal for it. I am learning how to be with myself so I don't disappear when I am with someone else. This kind of solitude requires courage, because it removes the distractions that romance can so easily provide. There is no daily reassurance of desirability, no mirrored identity formed through a partner's gaze. Instead, there is self-witnessing, and that can feel confronting before it feels liberating. A man who chooses solitude is often doing so to reclaim agency. He may have learned that being in a relationship before knowing himself led to accommodation instead of intimacy, performance instead of presence. Living alone allows him to observe his patterns without immediacy, to recognize his needs without negotiating them away, to sit with discomfort long enough for insight to surface. He learns the difference between wanting connection and needing validation, and that distinction changes everything. Desire becomes cleaner. Choice becomes intentional. There is also dignity in this choice. To live alone is to resist the pressure to couple for optics, to avoid relationships that soothe anxiety but starve the self. It is to say that companionship should add, not rescue. This man is not rejecting women, he is rejecting the idea that partnership is proof of worth. His solitude becomes a filtering mechanism. It sharpens his awareness of what he can offer and what he will no longer tolerate. Over time, solitude builds emotional stamina. He becomes less reactive, less rushed, less willing to betray himself just to avoid emptiness. He discovers that silence can be restorative, that evenings alone can be full, that joy does not always arrive dressed as another person. When he eventually steps toward relationship, it will not be to fill a gap, but to share a life already structured, already rooted, already alive. When a man lives alone long enough, something quietly radical begins to happen. He becomes his own emotional companion. Without a girlfriend to absorb his moods, soothe his disappointments, or reflect his sense of meaning back to him, he learns to hold his inner life with steadiness. This is not emotional isolation, it is emotional literacy. He starts to recognize what he feels without rushing to explain it away or outsource its management. Sadness is no longer a crisis that demands immediate comfort. Joy is no longer something that needs to be witnessed to feel real. Feelings simply exist, and he learns how to stay with them. Emotional self-reliance does not mean shutting down or becoming hardened. In fact, it requires greater sensitivity. When no one else is responsible for stabilizing your emotional world, you become attentive to its rhythms. You learn when to rest and when to move, when to push and when to pause. You develop rituals that support your inner balance, morning habits, evening reflections, small acts of self-respect that anchor the day. Over time, these practices create a sense of internal trust. He knows that if he falls apart, he is also capable of putting himself back together. This self-trust changes how he relates to others, even in their absence. He no longer sees intimacy as a transaction of emotional labor, where one person regulates what the other cannot. Instead, he understands that true closeness depends on two regulated inner worlds meeting, not colliding. By learning to be emotionally present with himself, he removes the hidden demand that a partner should complete or rescue him. This makes him safer to love and harder to manipulate. There is also a humbling clarity that comes with this self-reliance. He confronts his contradictions without an audience to perform for. He sees his strengths without exaggeration and his flaws without collapse. Living alone strips away the illusion that someone else will eventually fix what he avoids. It invites responsibility rather than blame. And in that responsibility, there is dignity. Yet this inner companionship is not meant to replace human connection. It prepares him for it. Because when a man can sit with his own fear, he does not ask someone else to carry it for him. When he can comfort himself in moments of doubt, he does not cling. He shows up in relationships with openness rather than expectation, curiosity rather than need. Love, for him, becomes a meeting place, not a dependency, and the quiet strength he developed alone becomes the foundation for deeper, more honest connection. Desire has a peculiar way of shaping identity when it is left unquestioned. For many men, longing becomes fused with validation, the feeling that being wanted confirms existence. But when a man lives alone without a girlfriend, desire is no longer constantly answered or mirrored back to him, and this changes his relationship with wanting itself. He begins to notice how much of desire is imagined, how much is habit, and how much is borrowed from cultural expectations rather than authentic need. In the absence of immediate fulfillment, longing becomes a teacher instead of a commander. Living alone exposes the difference between attraction and appeasement. Without romantic validation, the man must ask harder questions. Who am I when no one wants something from me? What parts of myself do I still choose when no one is watching? Desire turns inward before it turns outward. It refines itself. Instead of seeking someone to reassure his worth, he becomes curious about what truly draws him, what excites him, what aligns with his values rather than his insecurities. This is where identity begins to settle into something sturdier. There is discomfort in this process. Desire, when unfulfilled, can feel like restlessness, envy, or doubt. But staying with that discomfort reveals its deeper intelligence. He sees how craving can push him toward fantasies that promise relief but not nourishment. He recognizes the difference between wanting intimacy and wanting distraction, between hunger for connection and avoidance of self. As these distinctions emerge, he becomes less available for relationships that offer intensity without depth. By not tying his sense of self to romantic success, he frees desire from performance. He no longer needs to be chosen to feel legitimate. He no longer shapes himself primarily to be appealing. Instead, he shapes himself to be honest. This honesty shifts the direction of desire. It stops chasing admiration and starts seeking resonance. The question is no longer, am I wanted? But, does this reflect who I am becoming? There is also an erotic dimension to this autonomy that often goes unspoken. When a man owns his desire rather than outsourcing it, it becomes quieter but more potent. It is no longer frantic or compulsive. It has boundaries. It can wait. It becomes selective. Desire turns into a creative force, fuel for work, for growth, for imagination, rather than a restless ache demanding immediate satisfaction. In this space, identity is no longer negotiated in response to another person's availability. It is authored. Longing does not disappear, but it matures. It becomes less about being seen and more about seeing clearly. And from that grounded place, desire aligns with intimacy instead of appetite, guided by self-knowledge rather than the fear of being alone. Living alone grants a man a freedom that is rarely recognized because it is often mistaken for isolation. There are no compromises demanded by a partner's schedule, no negotiations over trivial habits, no constant adjustments to another person's moods or expectations. In this unshared space, he discovers the rare luxury of moving through life on his own terms, guided by discipline rather than impulse, by intention rather than necessity. This freedom is not chaos, it is a structured autonomy that demands responsibility. It is the freedom to create rituals that sustain him, to pursue projects that matter, to cultivate interests without apology or explanation. Every decision becomes a test of self-knowledge, because there is no one else to fill gaps or absorb consequences. Discipline emerges as the companion of this freedom. Without a partner to stabilize routines or manage emotional labor, the man must hold himself accountable. Mornings cannot be postponed, Meals cannot be neglected, financial obligations cannot be deferred indefinitely. In this way, solitude becomes a laboratory for self-mastery. He learns how to structure time, how to balance work, rest, and reflection. He discovers which habits fuel vitality and which drain it. The absence of external scaffolding does not weaken him, it sharpens his capacity to govern his own life. He comes to understand that freedom is not the absence of constraints but the ability to choose the constraints that serve growth and meaning. This shaping of the inner life allows him to engage with the external world differently. Decisions are made from clarity rather than compulsion. Relationships are approached with intention rather than desperation. Every encounter is filtered through self-awareness. He can see when desire is genuine, when curiosity is authentic, and when social pressure or loneliness might distort judgment. Freedom, coupled with discipline, transforms him from someone who reacts to circumstance into someone who designs the circumstances under which he thrives. There is a quiet power in this capacity, a sovereignty of choice that cannot be inherited, borrowed, or simulated. Moreover, this freedom cultivates resilience. Life's unpredictability is less threatening because he has learned to rely on his own resources. Challenges are met with a practiced calm, setbacks are endured with patience rather than panic. The man who lives alone discovers that the world cannot control him as long as he governs himself. His independence is not arrogance, it is the outcome of repeated choices that honor his values, his energy, and his boundaries. This autonomy does not isolate him from others but prepares him to engage fully and freely when relationships do emerge, with neither neediness nor compromise that erodes authenticity. The combination of freedom and discipline allows the man to live deliberately. It teaches him that being alone is not a gap to fill, but a framework in which he can refine the shape of his life, the contours of his desires, and the depth of his inner world. Redefining intimacy becomes a quiet revolution for a man who lives alone without a girlfriend. In a culture that equates closeness with constant physical presence or romantic entanglement, he learns that intimacy can exist without another body in the room. It is not something given or received, it is something cultivated within, a dialogue between the man and his own experience of life. He begins to understand that connection is not measured by frequency of contact or by how often someone mirrors your emotions, but by the depth with which you engage with yourself and the world around you. This awareness transforms his relationships because he no longer approaches others from scarcity or dependency, but from completeness and curiosity. He discovers that intimacy can be found in attention to thought, to feeling, to the rhythms of his own body. He learns to notice the subtleties of his moods, the quiet urgencies of desire, and the whispers of longing that often go unacknowledged. By tending to these inner experiences, he cultivates a kind of presence that is rare. A man who is fully awake to himself is also fully awake to others. The absence of a romantic partner sharpens this sensitivity. Without a partner to occupy the space of intimacy, he begins to occupy it himself, transforming what is usually experienced as loneliness into a form of emotional richness. There is also a patience that grows in this solitary intimacy. He no longer demands immediate gratification from connection because he has learned to provide for himself. Conversations with friends, family, or potential partners are approached without urgency or compulsion, and interactions are richer because they are not driven by fear of emptiness. He understands that presence is more meaningful than proximity, and that listening can be an act of intimacy as profound as touch. In this way, solitude does not shrink him, it expands his capacity to connect, both with himself and with the people he allows into his life. Redefining intimacy also allows him to question conventional narratives about desire and attachment. He recognizes that dependence masquerading as closeness often undermines true connection. By disentangling need from love, he builds relationships that are rooted in appreciation, respect, and mutual growth rather than in obligation or anxiety. His understanding of intimacy becomes more nuanced, more resilient, and more authentic. He learns that being alone does not mean being cut off from love or compassion, it means learning to inhabit the fullness of his emotional life so that when connection does occur, it is chosen, not demanded, and it is shared, not sacrificed. Through this process, intimacy evolves from a mere social or romantic contract into a deliberate practice, a practice of presence, honesty, and self-respect that reshapes not only his relationships with others but also the very way he inhabits his own life.